Glory, Vladimir Nabokov. A novel translated from the Russian by Dmitry Nabokov in collaboration with the author. Tuvera. Glory. Forward. The present work closes a series of definitive English versions in which my entire set of 9 Russian novels, written in Western Europe between 1925 and 1937, is published by immigrant houses between 1926 and 1952, is available to American and British readers. He who cares to scan the list given below should mark the dramatic gap between 1938 and 1959. Mashinka, 1926. Mary, 1970. Korol Dama Valet, in 1928. King Queen Knave, 1968. Zashita Luzhina, 1930. The Defense, 1964. Solgatine, 1930. The Eye, 1965. Povig, 1932. Glory, 1971. Camera Obscura, 1933. Laughter in the Dark, 1938. Octayene, 1936. Despair, 1966. Priglashnie na Kuzhin, 1938. Invitation to a Beheading, 1959. Dar, 1952. The Gift, 1963. The present translation is meticulously true to the text. My son took 3 years on and off to make a first draft, after which I spent 3 months preparing a fair copy. The very Russian preoccupations with physical movement and gesture, walking and sitting, smiling and glancing from under the brows, seems especially strong in Povig, and this made our task still tougher. Povig had begun in May 1930, immediately after my writing Sogliative, and completed by the end of that year. My wife and I, who were still then childless, rented a parlor and bedroom on Luitpoldstrasse, Berlin West, in the vast and gloomy apartment of the lone-legged General von Bartleben, an old gentleman solely occupied in working out his family tree. His large brow had a somewhat Nabokovian cast, and indeed he was related to the well-known chess player Bardelebin, whose manner of death resembled that of my Lucian. One day in early summer, Ilya Fondaminsky, a chief editor of the Sovremeny Zapisky, arrived there from Paris to buy the book Na Cornu in the Rooted State, set of grain fields before they are harvested. He was a social revolutionist, a Jew, a fervent Christian, a learned historian, an altogether delightful man, later murdered by the Germans in one of their extermination camps. And vividly do I remember the splendid zest with which he slapped his knees before rising from our green divan after the deal had been clinched. The book, certainly very attractive working title, later discarded in favor of the pithier Povig, Gallant Feat, High Deed, was Romanticheski Beck Romantic Times, which I had chosen partly because I had had enough of hearing Western journalists call our era materialistic, practical, utilitarian, etc., but mainly because the purpose of my novel, my only one with a purpose, lay in stressing the thrill and the glamour that my young expatriate finds in the most ordinary pleasures, as well as the seemingly meaningless adventures of a lonely life. It would make things too easy for a certain type of reviewer, and particularly for those insular innocents whom my work affects so oddly that one might think I hypnotized them from the wings into making indecent gestures were I to point out the faults of the novel. Suffice it to say that after all but lapsing into false exotism or commonplace comedy, it soars to heights of purity and melancholy that I have only attained in the much later Ada. How to maintain characters of glory stand in relation to those of my other 14 Russian and American novels? The human interest seeker may ask. Martin is the kindest, uprightest, and most touching of all my young men, and little Sonia, of the lustreless dark eyes and the coarse-looking black hair, her father, judging by his name, the Chermissian blood, should be acclaimed by experts in amorous lure and lore as being the most oddly attractive of all my young girls, although obviously a moody and ruthless flirt. If Martin to some extent can be considered a distant cousin of mine, nicer than I, but also more naive than I ever was, with whom I share certain childhood memories, certain later likes and dislikes, his pallid parents, per contra, do not resemble mine in any rational sense. As to Martin's Cambridge friends, Darwin is totally invented, and so is Moon. but Vadim and Teddy existed in the reality of my own Cambridge past. They are mentioned under their initials NR and RC respectively in my Speak Memory 1966, Chapter 13, penultimate paragraph. The three staunch patriots dedicated to counter-Bolshevist work, Zilanov, Ioglovich, and Gruzanov, belonged to that group of people politically situated just to the right of the old terrorists, just to the left of the constitutional Democrats, and as far from the monarchists on one side as from the Marxists on the other, whom I was well acquainted with in the entourage of Very magazine, with serialized public, but none is an exact portrait of a specific individual. I feel obliged to give here the proper determination of this political type, recognized at once with the unconscious precision of common knowledge by the Russian intelligent, who is the main reader of my books, because I still cannot reconcile myself to the fact, observing to the commemorated by an annual pyrotechnical display of contempt and sarcasm, that in the meantime American intellectuals have been conditioned by Bolshevist propaganda into utterly disregarding the vigorous existence of liberal thought among Russian expatriates. You're a Trotskyite, then? Rightly suggested an especially limited left-wing writer in New York, 1940, when I said I was neither the Soviets nor for the Tsar. The hero of glory, however, is not necessarily interested in politics. That is the first two master tricks on the part of the wizard who made Martin. Fulfillment is the frugal theme of his destiny. He is that rarity, a person whose dreams come true. But the fulfillment itself is invariably permeated by poignant nostalgia. The memory of the childish reverie blends with the expectation of death. The perilous path that Martin finally follows into forbidden Zorland, no connection with Nabokov's Zembla, only continues to its illogical end, the fairy tale trail, winding through the painted woods of a nursery wall picture. Fulfillment would have been perhaps an even better title for the novel. Nabokov cannot be aware that the obvious translation of public is exploit, and indeed, it is under that title that his public is listed by bibliographers. But if you once perceive and exploit the verb utilize, gone is the public, the inutile deed of renown. The author chose, therefore, to oblique glory, which is less literal but much richer rendering of the original title, with all its natural associations branching in the bronze sun. It is the glory of high adventure and disinterested achievement, the glory of all this earth and its patchy paradise, the glory of personal pluck, the glory of a radiant martyr. Nowadays, when Freudism is discredited, the author recalls with a whistle of wonder that not so long ago, say before 1959, i.e. before the publication of the first of the 7 forwards to his English novels, a child's personality was supposed to split automatically in sympathetic consequence of parental divorce. His parent separation had no such effect on Martin's mind, and only a desperate saphead in the throes of a nightmare examination may be excused for connecting Martin's plunge into his fatherland with his having been deprived of his father. No less reckless would it be to point out with gloomy wonder that the girl Martin loves and his mother bear the same name. My second wand-stroke is this. Among the many gifts I showered on Martin, I was careful not to include talent. How easy it would have been to make him an artist, a writer. How hard it not to let him be one, while bestowing on him the keen sensitivity that one generally associates with a creative creature. How cruel to prevent him from finding an art, not an escape, which is only a cleaner cell on a quieter floor, but relief from the itch of being. The temptation to perform my own little exploit with the omnibus nimbus prevailed. The result reminds me of a chess problem I once composed. Its beauty lay in paradoxical first move. The white queen had 4 likely squares at its disposal, but on any of these it would be in the way, such a powerful piece and in the way, of one of White's knights in 4 mating variants, in other words, being an absolutely useless spoil-sport and burden on the board, with no part whatever in many of the subsequent play. It had to exile itself in a neutral corner behind an inert pawn and remain wedged there in idle obscurity. The problem was diabolically difficult to construct, so is Podvik. The author thrusts his wise readers to refrain from avidly flipping through this autobiography, Speak Memory, in quest to duplicate items or kindred scenery. The fun and glory is elsewhere. It is to be sought in the echoing and linking of minor events and back-and-forth switches, which produce an illusion of impetus, an old daydream directly becoming the blessing of the ball hugged to one's chest, or the casual vision of Martin's mother grieving beyond the time frame of the novel in abstraction, of the future that the reader can only guess at even after he races through the last 7 chapters, where irregular madnesses, structural twists, and masquerade of all characters culminate in a furious finale, although nothing much happens at the very end, just a bird perching on a wicket in the grayness of a wet day. Vladimir Nabokov, December 8, 1970, Montreal. 1. Funny as it may seem, Martin's grandfather, Edelweiss, was a Swiss, a robust Swiss, with a fluffy mustache who in the 1860s had been tutor to the children of a St. Petersburg landowner named Indrikov, and had married his youngest daughter. Martin assumed at first the velvety white alpine flower, that pet of herbariums, had been named in honor of his grandfather. Even later he could not fully relinquish this notion. He remembered his grandfather distinctly, but only in one form and position, the corpulent old man dressed completely in white, fair-whiskered, bearing a Panama hat and a pique waistcoat rich in breloques, the most amusing of which was a dagger the size of a fingernail sitting on a bench in front of the house in a Linden's mill-boil shade. It was on this very bench that his grandfather had died, holding in the palm of his hand his beloved gold watch, whose lip was like a little golden mirror. Apoplexy overtook him during his timely gesture, and according to family legend, the hand stopped at the moment as his heart. For many years later, Grandfather Edelweiss was preserved in a massive leather album. In his day, photographs were made tastefully with elaborate deliberation. The operation was no joking matter. The patient had to be immobilized for a long time, and permission to smile had yet to come with the advent of a snapshot. The complexity and heliography accounted for his weightiness and solidity of Grandfather's manly poses in those somewhat pale but very good quality pictures. Grandfather as a youth was a freshly killed woodcock at his feet. Grandfather astride the mare Daisy. Grandfather on a striped veranda seat with a black dachshund that had refused to sit still and had come out with 3 tails in the photograph. Only in 1918 did Grandfather Edelweiss disappear altogether, for the album went up in flames, as did the table where the album lay, and in fact the whole country house, which the peasant chaps from the nearby village foolishly burned to the ground as it stood, instead of realizing a profit from the furnishings. Martin's father was a dermatologist and a famous one. Like Grandfather, he too was very white-skinned and stout, enjoyed fishing for gobies in his spare time, and possessed a magnificent collection of daggers and sabers, as well as long, strange pistols, on the account of which the users of more modern weapons nearly sent him before the firing squad. In the beginning of 1918, he grew bloated and short of breath, and died around March 10 in unclear circumstances. His wife Sophia and their son were living at the time near Yalta. The town kept trying on, now one regime, now another, and one could not make up its finicky mind. She was a rosy, freckled, youthful woman, with pale hair in a big bun, high eyebrows that were thickish toward the bridge of her nose and nearly imperceptible toward her temples, and little slits, once made for now absent earrings, in the elongated lobes of her delicate ears. Only recently, in their northern country place, she still used to play a powerful, agile game of tennis in the garden court, which had been in existence since the 80s. In the autumn, she would spend a lot of time riding a black, unfilled bicycle along the avenues of their park, across noisily rustling carpets of dry leaves, or else she would set out on foot along the resilient shoulder of the highway and cover the long way dear to her since childhood from Olkovo to Vorskut, raising and lowering the end of her expensive coral-knobbed cane like a seasoned walker. In St. Petersburg she was known as an Anglomaniac, and relished this fame, but would discuss eloquently such topics as Boy Scouts and Kipling, and found quite special delight in frequent visits to Duke's English shop, where still on stairs before a large poster, a woman thickly lathering a boy's head, you were greeted by a wonderful smell of soap and lavender, with something mere mixed in, something that suggested collapsible rubber tubs, soccer balls, and round, heavy, tightly swaddled Christmas puddings. It follows that Martin's first books were English. His mother loved the Russian magazine for children, Zadushinov Savo, the heartfelt word, and inspired in such aversion for Madame Charsky's young heroines with dusky complexions, titles that even much later Martin was wary of any book written by a woman, sensing even in the best of books an unconscious urge on the part of middle-aged and perhaps chubby lady to dress up in pretty name and curl up on the sofa like a pussycat. Sophia detested diminutives, kept a strict check on herself so as not to use them, was annoyed when her husband said, "Sonny's got a coffins again. Let's check on his temperatura." Russian children's literature swarmed with cute lisping words, when not committing the sin of moralizing, and Martin's grandfather family name bloomed in the mountains. The magical origin of his grandmother's maiden name was a far cry for the various Volkovs, Wolfs, Kunitzes, and Martins, and Belkins, Squirrelsons, and belonged to the fauna of Russian fable. Once upon a time there prowled marvelous beasts in our country, but Sophia found Russian fairy tales clumsy, cruel and squalid, Russian folk songs inane, and Russian riddles idiotic. She had little faith in Pushkin's famous many, and said that the poet himself had invented her, together with her fairy tales, knitting needles, and heartache. Thus, in early childhood, Martin failed to become familiar with something that subsequently, through the prismatic wave of memory, might have added an extra enchantment to his life. However, he had no lack of enchantments and no cause to regret that it was not the Russian knight-errant Ruslan, but Ruslan's Occidental brother, that had awakened his imagination in childhood. But then what does it matter whence comes from the gentle nudge that jars the soul into motion and sets it rolling, doomed never again to stop? 2. On the bright wall above the narrow crib, with its lateral meshes of white cord and the small icon of its head, Blackguard Saint's brown face framed in foil, crimson underside plush somewhat eaten by moths, or by Martin himself, hung a watercolor depicting a dense forest with a winding path disappearing into its depths. Now, in one of those English books that his mother used to read to him, how slowly and mysteriously she would pronounce the words, now wide she would open her eyes when she reached the end of a passage, covering it with her small, slightly freckled hand as she asked, "And what do you think happened next?" There was a story about just such a picture, with a path in the woods right above the bed of a little boy who, in one fine night, just as he was a nightshirt and all, went from his bed into the picture, onto the path that disappeared into the woods. His mother thought Martin anxiously might notice the resemblance between the watercolor on the wall and the illustration in the book, and she would then become alarmed, and according to his calculations avert their nocturnal journey by removing the picture. Therefore, every time he prayed in bed before going to sleep, first came a short prayer in English, "Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, listen to a little child," and then "Our Father," in the sibilant Slavonic version, pattering rapidly and trying to get his knees up on the pillow, which his mother considered inadmissible on exceeded grounds. Martin prayed God she would not notice the tempting path right over his head. When, as a youth, he recalled the past, he would wonder if one night he had not actually hopped from one bed to the picture, and if this had not been the beginning of the journey, full of joy and anguish, into which his whole life had turned. He seemed to remember the chilly touch of the ground, the green twilight of the forest, the bends of the trail which the hump of a great root crossed here and there, the tree trunks flashing by as he ran past them on barefoot, and the strange dark air teeming with fabulous possibilities. Grandmother Edelweiss Inderkopf worked diligently at the watercolors in her youth, and as she mixed the blue paint with the yellow on her porcelain palette, she could hardly foresee that in this nascent greenery her grandson would one day water. The thrill which Martin discovered, and which, in various manifestations and blending, accompanied him throughout his life, from that moment on proved to be precisely the feeling that his mother hoped to develop in him, even though she herself would have been hard to put to find a name for it. She just knew that every evening she must feed Martin the way she had once been fed by her late governess, old wise Miss Brooke, whose son had collected orchids in Borneo and had flown over the Sahara in a balloon and had died in a Turkish bath where the boiler burst. She would read, and Martin would listen, kneeling on a chair with his eyebrows propped on a lamplit round table, and it was very hard to stop and lend him to bed, since he would always beg her to read some more. Sometimes she would carry him upstairs to the nursery on her back. This was called logging. At bedtime he would be given an English biscuit from a blue paper tin box. The top ones were of wonderful kinds coated with sugar. Next came ginger and coconut cookies, and on the sad night when he reached the bottom layer, he would have to reconcile himself to a third-rate variety, plain and insipid. Nothing was wasted on Martin, neither the crunchy English cookies nor the adventures of King Arthur's knights. What a rapturous moment when he was a youth, perchance a nephew of St. Tristram's, donned for the first time piece by piece his shiny convex plate armor and rode off the first single combat. There were also those distant circular islands at which a damsel gazed from the shore, the garment streaming in the wind, and a hooded falcon perched on a wrist, and Sinbad with his red kerchief and the gold ring in his ear, and the sea serpent and its green tire-shaped segments jutting out of the water all the way to the horizon, and the child, finding the spot at the end of the rainbow, met the ground, and like echo on all of this, an image somehow related to it, the magnificent model of a brown-paneled sleeping car, the widow of Society to Wagenlit, et des Grands Express Europeans in the Nevsky Avenue, where one was walked on a dull frosty way with slight spinners of snow and had to wear black knit snow pants over one's stockings and shorts. 3. His mother's love for Martin was so jealous, so violent, so intense that it seemed to make the hearts hoarse. When her marriage broke up and she began living separately with Martin, she would go on Sundays to visit his father at their former apartment, where he would potter for a long time with pistols and daggers, while his father read the paper impassively and answered every now and then without looking up, "Yes, loaded," or "Yes, poisoned." On these occasions Sophia would hardly bear to stay at home, tormented by the ridiculous thought that her indolent husband might try something after all and keep his son with him. Martin, on the other hand, was very affectionate and polite with his father, so as to mitigate the punishment as much as possible, since he believed that his father had been banished for a misdemeanor committed one summer evening at their country house when he had done something to the piano that made it emit an absolutely staggering sound, as if someone had stepped on its tail, and the day after that had left for St. Petersburg and never returned. This happened in the very same year when the Grand Duke of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. Martin imagined that Sarajevo was a man very distinctly with a Grand Duke and a plumed hat, defending himself with a sword against a half-dozen black-cloaked conspirators, and was disappointed when his error became evident. The blow on the piano keys occurred in his absence. He was in the adjoining room brushing his teeth with thick, foamy, sweet-tasting toothpaste rendered especially attractive the inscription in English, "We could not improve the paste, so we improved the tube." Indeed, the aperture formed a transverse slit so that the paste, as it was squeezed out, slid into the brush not like a worm but like a ribbon. That last discussion with her husband Sophia recalled in its entirety, complete in every detail and shading. On the day the news of his death reached her in Yalta, her husband had been sitting near a little wicker table, examining the tips of his short, outspread fingers, and she had been telling him that they could not go on like that any longer, that they had long since become strangers, that she was willing to take her son and leave him tomorrow. Her husband smiled lazily and answered in a quiet, slightly husky voice that she was right, alas, and he would leave himself and find a separate apartment in town. His quiet voice placed placid obesity and most of all the file with which he continually mangled his soft nails drove her out of her wits, and the calm with which they both discussed their separation seemed to her monstrous, even though their violent language and tears would of course have been more awful still. Presently he got up, and still fiddling with the nail file, began pacing back and forth across the room, speaking at a gentle smile about the minor household details of the forthcoming separate existence, and here a town carriage played an absurd role. Then, suddenly, without any reason, as he passed the open piano, he brought his closed fist down on the keyboard with all his might, and it was as if a discordant howl had burst in through a momentary open door. After this he resumed the interrupted sentence in the same quiet voice, and the next time past the piano he carefully closed the lid. The death of his father, whom he did not love much, shocked Martin for the very reason that he did not love him as he should, and besides he could not get rid of himself of the thought that his father had died in disgrace. It was then that Martin understood for the first time that human life flowed in zigzags, that now the first bit had been passed, and that his life had turned at the instant his mother had summoned him from the Cypress Avenue to the terrace, and said in a strange voice, "I have received a letter from Zilanov." Then continuing in English, "I want you to be brave, very brave. It is about your father. He is no more." Martin turned pale and smiled a bewildered smile. Then he rode for a long time in Vorontsov Park, repeating now and then the infantine nickname he had once bestowed on his father, and trying to imagine, and imagining with certain warm, dreary contingency, that his father was beside him, in front, behind, under the cedar over there on the sloping lawn, nearby, far off, everywhere. It was hot, even though the rainstorm had raged a short time before. Blowflies buzzed around the glossy nadler shrubs. An ill-tempered black swan floated in the pool, moving from side to side in its bill, which was so crimson that it seemed painted. Petals had fallen from the almond trees, and stood out pale on the dark earth of the damp path, like almonds in gingerbread. Not far from some enormous cedars of Lebanon grew a lone birch tree with that particular slant to its foliage that only a birch has, as if a girl had let her hair down on one side to be combed, and stood still. A zebra-striped swallowtail glided past, its tails extended and joined. The sparkling air, the shadows of the cypresses, old trees with rusty casts, their small cones half hidden under the cloaks, the black glass of the pool where concentric circles spread around the swan, the radiant blue into which serrated Mount Petri rose, wearing a broad belt of caracal-like pine. Everything was permeated with agonizing bliss, and it seemed to Martin that somehow his father played a part in the distribution of shadow and shine. "If you were 20 instead of 15, said his mother that evening, "if you had already finished high school, and if I were no longer alive, then of course you could. I suppose it would be your duty to—" She paused in mid-sentence, thinking of White Army, and seeing with her mind's eye the South Russian prairie and Cossack-capped horsemen, among whom she tried to recognize Martin from afar, but thank God he stood next to her in an open-necked shirt, his hair close-cropped, his skin sun-browned, with untanned little lines radiating from the corners of his eyes, while on the other hand, if we return to St. Petersburg, she went on in a questioning tone, and at some anonymous station a shell exploded, and a locomotive reared up. "All this will probably end one day," she added after a pause. "In the meantime, we must think up something." "I'm going for a swim," put in Martin, with a conciliatory intonation. "The whole gang is there, Nicky, Leda." "Yes, go, by all means," said Sophia. "After all, the revolution will end some day, and it will be strange remembering it. Our stay in the Crimea has done wonders for your health, and will somehow finish your schooling at the Yalta Gymnasium. Look, isn't that cliff beautifully lit up over there? That night neither mother nor son could sleep, and both thought about death. Sophia tried to think in an undertone, that is, without sobbing or sighing. The door to her room Son's room was ajar. She recalled again punctuously in detail everything that had led up to her separation from Edelweiss. Going over every instant, she saw clearly that in circumstance, and that she could not have acted otherwise, but still a mistake lurked hidden somewhere, still as if they had not parted. He would not have died like that, alone in an empty room, suffocating, helpless, perhaps recalling their last year of happiness, and very comparative happiness at that, and their last trip abroad, to Biarritz, the excursion to Croix de Moguer, and the little galleries of Bayonne. She firmly believed in the certain powder that bore same resemblance to God at the house of a man one has never seen his belongings, his greenhouse and his beehives, his distant voice heard by the chance in open field, bare to their owner. It would have embarrassed her to call the power God, just as there is Peters and Ivans cannot pronounce Pete or Vanya without a sensation of falsity, and there are others who, in reporting a long conversation to you, will pronounce their own names, or still worse, nicknames, with gusto 20 times or so. The power had no connection with the church, and neither absolved nor chastised any sins. It was just that she sometimes felt ashamed of the presence of a tree, a cloud, a dog, or out the air itself, and bore an ill word as religiously as a kind one. And now Sophia, as she thought about her unpleasant, unloved husband and about his death, even though she repeated the words of prayers natural to her ever since childhood, actually strained her whole being so that, fortified by 2 or 3 happy memories, through the mist and through great extensions of space, through all that would always remain incomprehensible, she might give her husband a kiss on the forehead. She never discussed the things of the kind openly with Martin, but she always had the feeling that everything else they talked about had created for Martin through her voice and her love, and the same sense of divinity as lived within her. Lying in the next room, feigning to snore to his mother, would not think as he was awake. Martin also recalled the harrowing things, also trying to comprehend his father's death so as to catch a wisp of posthumous tenderness in the dark of the room. He thought about his father with the full force of his soul, and even made certain experiments. If right now a board in the floor creaks or there is a knock of some kind, that means he hears me and responds. Martin felt afraid, waiting for the knock. The closeness of the night air oppressed him. He could hear the surf boom, mosquitoes emitted their high-pitched whine, or else, with absolute clarity, he would suddenly see his father's round face, his pince-nez, the fair crop of his brush cut, the fleshly button of a wart near his nostril, and the shiny ring formed of 2 little gold serpents around the knot of his eye. When at last he fell asleep, he found himself sitting in the classroom with his homework not done, and Lida kept idly scratching her shin as she told him that Georgians did not eat ice cream. Grushny ne yet morashetiko, for he did not inform either Lida or her brother of his father's death, since he had doubted that he could utter the news naturally, while it would have been indecorous to tell him it with a feeling. From early childhood, his mother had taught him that no discuss like a profound emotional experience which in open air immediately evanescence and fades, oddly becomes similar to an analogous experience in one's interlocutor, was not only vulgar but a sin against sentiment. She detested the ribbons of funeral wreaths with silver inscriptions such as "To a young hero," or "To an unforgettable darling daughter," or disapproved of sedate and mawkish people who, as they lose a dear one, find it possible to shed tears in public, while in another moment, on a day of good luck, even though bursting with joy, they would never allow themselves to break out laughing at a passing stranger's face. Once when Martin was about 8, he attempted to shear hair off a shaggy little dog, and had to inadvertently cut its ear. Embarrassed for some reason to explain that he simply intended to snip off the excess tufts before painting to look like a tiger, Martin met his mother's indignation with stoic silence. She offered to him lower his pants and lie down prone. He did so in complete silence. In complete silence she whipped him with a riding switch of tawny bullgut. Then he spooled up his pants, and she helped him button them to the little undervest. As he had begun doing it askew, he then went out, and only there in the park let himself go, wailing his heart out, and tears mixed with bilberries. Meanwhile his mother was weeping in the bedroom, and in the evening she was barely able to hold back new tears, as a very cheerful and plump Martin sat in the tub, nudging along a celluloid swan, and presently stood up to let his back be lathered as she saw the vivid pink stripes of his tender buttocks. Such chastisement took place only once, nor did Sophia ever lift her head, threatening to slap him for this or that petty misdemeanor as French and German mothers do. Martin, who had learned early to control his tears and conceal his emotions, astonished his schoolteachers with insensitivity. Meanwhile, he soon discovered himself a trait that he felt compelled to conceal with particular tenacity, that at 16 of the Crimea. This was the cause of a certain amount of torment. Martin noticed that on occasion he was so afraid of seemingly unmanly to become known as a coward that he involuntarily reacted in just the way a coward would. The blood left his face, his legs trembled, and his heart pounded tightly in his chest, admitting to himself that he was not possessed of genuine innate sang-froid, nevertheless firmly resolved to behave always as a fearless man at his place. At the same time, vanity and self-esteem were highly developed in him. Lida's brother Kolya, though of the same age as Martin, was skinny and short. Martin felt that he could pin him without much trouble, and yet the possibility of such a chance of defeat made him so nervous that he imagined it with such hideous clarity, and never once did he try to start a wrestling match with that coeval. However, he would willingly accept a challenge from Ivanova, a 20-year-old cavalry officer with muscles like round rocks, killed 6 months later in the Battle of Melitopol, who would rough him up mercilessly and after exhausting tussle at last press him red and grinning to the grass. There also was that night, the warm Crimean night, with the blue-black of the cypresses, brought out by the chalky white of the ghostly Tartar walls in the moonlight, when on his way home from Adreitz, where Lita's family lived, a human shape abruptly appeared at the turn of a flinty path that led to the highway. A deep voice asked, "Who goes there?" Martin noted with a chagrin that his heart missed a beat. "Aha, it must be Deadman the Tartar," added the voice, and a man's face advanced menacingly through the torn back web of the shadows. "No," said Martin, "please let me pass, and I say you are a dead man, a comet," insisted the other, quietly but even more grimly. In a gleam of the moonlight, Martin noticed that he was holding a large revolver in his hand. "All right, stand against the wall," said the man, his tone no longer threatening but conciliatory and matter-of-fact. Shadow again engulfed the pale hand of the dark weapon, but a glistening speck remained where it had been. Martin was faced with two alternatives. The first was to insist on explanation, the second to dodge into the darkness and run. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he said awkwardly, and gave his name. "Against the wall," shouted the man in trouble. "There isn't any wall right here," said Martin. "I'll wait until there is," enigmatically observed the man, and with a crunch of pebbles either squatted or sat down. It was impossible to tell in the dark. Martin remained standing where he was, feeling a kind of faint itch in the whole left part of his chest where the now invisible barrel must be pointed. "One move and I'll kill you," murmured the man, and added something unintelligible. Martin stood for a while, and then after a while longer, trying painfully to think what a daredevil unarmed would do in his place, he could think of nothing, and suddenly asked, "Would you like a cigarette? I have some." He did not know how this had escaped, and immediately felt ashamed, especially since the offer remained without reply. The Martin decided that his only means of redeeming his shameful words was to go straight at the man, knock him down if necessary, but to pass. He thought of the picnic planned for tomorrow, of Lita's legs, even covertly coated with a lacquer-smooth reddish-gold tan, and imagined that perhaps his father was expecting him that night, and perhaps he was making preparations of some kind for the meeting. And here Martin caught himself feeling a strange hostility toward his father, for which he reproached himself for a long time. The sea swoosh could be heard with regularly spaced booms, loud crickets engaged in clockwork, competitive chirring, and here was the imbecile in the dark. Martin, as he now realized, was protecting his heart with his hand, calling himself a coward at one time. He moved forward abruptly. Nothing happened. He stumbled over the man's leg, but the latter did not remove it. He was sitting hunched over, head bowed, snoring softly, and giving off a thick, rich reek of wine. After getting home safely and enjoying a good night's sleep, Martin, as he stood next morning on the wisteria-entwined balcony, regretted that he had not disarmed the inert reveler. It would have been wise in immediately displaying the confiscated revolver. He remained cross with himself because, in his opinion, he had not risen to the occasion. Upon encountering long-awaited danger, how many times in the high road of his dreams, wearing a half-mask and jack-boots, he had stopped either a stagecoach or a bulky Berlin horseman, and then distributed his merchant's ducats to the poor. During his term as captain of a pirate corvette, he had stood with his back to the mainmast, single-handedly fighting off the onrush of mutinous crew. He had been sent into the depths of Africa to search for a lost explorer. When at last he found him in the wildwood of a nameless region, he went up to him with a polite bow. Flaunting with self-control, he would escape from hard labor camps across tropical swamplands, walk toward the pole past astonished, erect penguins, astride a leathery steed. With bared saber would be the first to burst into insurgent Moscow, and now Martin would catch himself embellishing in retrospect the inept and rather insipid nocturnal incident, which bore no more resemblance to the real life he lived in his fantasies than an incoherent dream does to the full authentic reality. And as sometimes, when recounting a dream, we smooth over, round off, embellish here and there so as to raise it at last to the level of plausible realistic absurdity, in exactly the same way Martin, when rehearsing the account of his nighttime encounter, which he did not, however, intend to make public, made the stranger more sober, his revolver more functional, and his own words wittier. 5. The next day, when passing a soccer ball back and forth with Kolya, or searching for Lydia on the shining beach bench for the seaside curios, a brown pebble with a colored belt, a little horseshoe, grainy and red-brown with rust, pale green sea-polished fragments of bottle glass that reminded him of his early childhood in Biarritz, Martin wondered at the night's adventure, doubted that it had really happened, and promoted it more and more decisively into that realm where all he selected from the world for the use of his soul would take root and begin living a marvelous independent existence. A wave would swell, boil with foam, topple rotundly, spreading and running up on a shingle. Then, unable to hold fast, it would slip back to the grumbling awakened pebbles, and hardly had it proceeded when a new one with the same round, joyful splash would come toppling and stretching out in the transparent stratum to the limit for it. Colia was throwing a piece of board had found for the lady the fox terrier to retrieve, and she would both front paws together and bounce across the water before tensely proceeding to swim. The next wave would catch her up and sweep her powerfully back to deposit her perfectly safely on the shore. Then she would drop on the shingle before her stick wrestled from the sea and shake herself violently. The two boys were bathing in this buff. Lita took her up the dip, and her mother and Sophia much earlier in the morning retired towards some rocks where she called as if in honor of that painter's seascapes. Colia swam with a tumbling motion, Tartar style, while Martin prided himself on swift and correct quarrel, where he learned from an English house tutor during which his last summer in North. However, neither of the boys would swim very far out, and in this connection one of Martha's sweetest and creepiest daydreams was of desolate stormy sea after a shipwreck, and himself alone in the dark, holding above water a Creole girl with whom he had danced the tango on deck the evening before. After a swim it was wonderfully pleasant to stretch out naked on hot stones, and with head tipped back look at the cypresses, thrust white black daggers and deep into the sky. Colia, a Alta doctor's son, who had lived all his life in the Crimea, accepted these cypresses, an ecstatic sky, and marvelously blue sea, with its dazzling metallic scales as something normal and routine. It was difficult to draw him into Martin's favorite games and transform him into the Creole's husband by chance. Cast up to the same uninhabited island, in the evening they would climb along narrow corridors and cypresses to Adretz, the large, ridiculous villa with its many staircases, passages, and galleries so amusingly constructed, and sometimes simply could not tell on which level you were. Having gone up a few steps, you suddenly found yourself on the expected mezzanine floor, but on the garden terrace was already shining through with yellow kerosene light, and the sound of voices and the clink of the crockery came from the main veranda. Lita would go over to the adult camp. Colia would gorge himself and immediately go off to bed. Martin sat in the dark on the bottom steps, and consuming cherries out of his hand, hearkened to the gay, brightly lit voices, to Ivanov's guffaws, Lita's cozy patter, and an argument between her father and the painter Danielewski. The garrulous stutterer. In general, the guests were numerous. Giggly girls in bright kerchiefs, officers from Yalta, and panicky elderly neighbors who had taken en masse to the hills during an incursion of the Reds the previous winter. It was never clear who had brought whom, and who was friends with whom, and the hospitality of Lita's mother, an inconspicuous woman who wore gorget and spectacles, knew no bounds. Thus one day appeared Arkady Zarkansky, a lanky, deathly pale man who had some connection or other with the theater, one of those absurd people who tour battlefronts, giving poetry recitals, musical accompaniment, arranged performances on the eve of a town's devastation, run off to buy epaulets, and never managed to run far away enough, returning instead, puffing heavily with a miraculously obtained top hat for the last act of a dream of love. He was balding and had a fine dynamic profile, but en face he turned out to be less handsome. Bags swelled beneath the mud-colored eyes, and the one incisor was missing. As for his personality, he was gentle, kind, sensitive man, and when they all would go out for a walk at night, he would sing in a velvety baritone, the romance beginning. Do you recall our sitting on the seashore, the sunset's glow with scarlet stripe into the sky, or tell an Armenian joke in the darkness, and in the darkness someone would laugh? On meeting him for the first time, Martin, with amazement and even a certain horror, recognized in him the drunk who had invited him to stand against the wall and be shot, but apparently Zarkansky remembered nothing, so that the dead man's identity remained unclear. Zarkansky was an outstanding drinker, and had got violent with his cups, but the revolver, which reappeared one day during a picnic on the mountain plateau above Yalta one night shaped in the moonlight, cricket-jerk muscatel wine, turned out to have an empty cylinder. For a long time Zarkansky went on shouting, threatening, mumbling, taking of some fatal love of his. They covered him with a military greatcoat, and he went to sleep. Lita sat close to the campfire with her chin propped on her hands, with shiny dancing eyes, reddish-brown for the flames watched escaping sparks. Presently Martin stood up, stretched his legs, ascended a dark, tufty slope, and walked to the edge of the precipice. Right under his feet he saw a broad black abyss, and beyond it the sea, which seemed to be raised and brought closer to a full man's wake, the Turkish trail, spreading in the middle and narrowing it as he approached the horizon. To the left, in the murky, mysterious distance, shimmered the diamond lights of Yalta. And when Martin would turn, he saw the flaming, restless nest of the fire a short distance away, and the silhouettes of people around it, and someone's hand holding a branch. The crickets kept crepitating. From time to time there came a sweet whiff of burning juniper, and above the black Alpenstein steppe, above the silken sea, the enormous, all-engulfing sky, the death gray with stars, made one's head spin. And suddenly Martin again experienced a feeling he had known on one more occasion as a child, an unbearable intensification of all his senses, a magical and demanding impulse, the presence of something for which it alone was worth living. 6. That moon's scintillating wake enticed one in the same ways as had the forest path in the nursery picture and the clustered lights of Yalta amid the extensive blackness of unknown composition and properties reminded him too of a childhood impression, aged 9, wearing only his nightshirt. With chilled heels, he knelt at a sleeping car window. The Sud Express hurtled across the French countryside, Sophia, having put her son to bed, had joined her husband in the dining car. The maid was sound asleep in her upper berth. It was dark in the narrow compartment. Only the blue fabric of the night's lamp flexible shade had let some light through. Its tassel swayed. The panels creaked softly, having wriggled out from under the sheet. He had crawled along the blanket to the window and raised the leathern curtain. For this he had to undo a button, after which the curtain slid smoothly up. He shivered with cold. His knees ached, but he could not tear himself away from the window, beyond which the oblique hillsides of the night rushed past. It was then that he suddenly saw what he now remembered. On the Crimean plateau, between the two black hills, the lights would hide and reappear, and then came the twinkling from a completely different direction. Abruptly it vanished, as if somebody had covered them up with a black kerchief. Soon the train braked and stopped in the darkness. Strangely disembodied noises became audible within the ear. Monotonous speech, coughing, that his mother's voice passed down the corridor, and deducing his parents were returning from the dining car and might look in on the way to the adjacent compartment, Martin stepped quickly back into bed. A little while later the train began to move, but then stopped for good, emitting a long, softly sibilant sigh of relief, and simultaneously pale stripes of light passed slowly across the dark compartment, and Martin once again crawled over to the window. He saw a lighted station platform. A man passed trundling a iron baggage cart with a muffled clatter, and the cart was a crate with a mysterious inscription, fragile. Several midges and one large moth circled around a gas lantern. Shadowy people shuffled along the platform, conversing about unknown things as they went. Then there was a jiggle of buffers, and the train glided off. Lamps passed and disappeared. A small structure, brightly lit inside and housing a row of levers, appeared also past. The train rocked gently as it switched tracks. Everything grew dark beyond the window, and once again there was a rushing light. And again, out of the nowhere, no longer between the two hills, but somewhere much closer and more tangible, a familiar light spilled forth, and the engine emitted a long plaintive whistle, as if it, too, were sorry to leave them behind. Then became a sharp bang, and an oncoming train shot past, and vanished as if it had never existed. The undulating black night resumed its smooth course, and the elusive nights gradually thinned into nothingness. When they had finally disappeared, Martin fastened his window shade and lay down. He awoke very early. The train's motion seemed smoother and more relaxed, as if it had become accustomed to the rapid pace. When he unfastened the shade, he felt a momentary dizziness, for the ground was rushing fast in the opposite direction, and the earthly, ash-pale light of the clear sky was unexpected too, and absolutely new to him were the terraced, olive-covered slopes. From the station they went to Biarritz in a hired landau, along a dusty road bordered by the dusty brambles, and since Martin saw blackberries for the first time in his life, the station was for some reason called the Negresse. It was full of questions. Today, at the age of 16, he kept comparing the Crimean Sea to the ocean in Biarritz. Yes, the Biscay waves were higher, the breakers more violent, and the fat Basque baigneur was perennial wet bathing suit. That's a killing profession, his father used to say. Would take Martin by the hand and lead him into the shallow water. They would both turn their backs to the surf, and a huge roaring wave would rush upon them from behind, drowning and overturning the entire world. On the first mirror-like strip of beach, a swarthy-faced woman with gray wisps of hair on her chin would meet those who had finished bathing and throw a fluffy beach towel over one's shoulders. Further on, in a cabin that smelled of tar, an attendant would help you yank off the clammy and clinging bathing suit. You would bring a tub of hot, almost boiling water where you had to immerse your feet. Then Martin, with his parents, had dressed. They would sit on the beach, and Mother with her big white hat under a frilly white umbrella, Father also with an umbrella, but a cream-colored masculine one, and Martin in a striped jersey and sun-browned straw hat with HMS Indomitable on the ribbon around his crown. His pants rolled all the way up. He would build sandcastles surrounded by moats. A waffle man, wearing a beret, would come by and turn with a grinding noise the handle of the red tin casket contained his wares, and those large curved chunks of waffle mixed with flying sand and sea salt remained among the most vivid memories of that period. Behind the beach, on the stone promenade, undulated by the waves on stormy days, a pert well-reft far from young flower woman would insert a carnation in the buttonhole of Father's white jacket, while Father kindly, comically observed the procedure of insertion, thrusting out his lower lip and pressing the folds of his chin against the lapel. It was a shame at the end of September to leave the happiest seaside with a white villa and its gnarled fig tree that refused to yield even one ripe fruit. On the way home, they stopped in Berlin, where boys on roller skates and even an occasional adult with a briefcase under his arm would clatter by along the asphalt of the streets. And then there were the marvelous toy shops, locomotives, tunnels, viaducts, and tennis courts on the outskirts of the city, and the Kurfürstendamm, and the starry night ceiling of the Winter Garden, and a trip to the pine woods of the Charlottenburg on a cool, clear day in the white electric cab. At the frontier, one had to change trains. Martin realized that he had forgotten in his compartment the penholder and the tiny glass lens in which, when held up to your eye, the mother-of-pearl and blue landscape would flash into being. But during supper at the station, a hazel hen with lingonberry sauce. The sleeping car attendant brought it. Then father gave him a ruble. Snow and frost met one on the Russian side of the border. A whole mountain of logs swelled up, and a tender crimson Russian locomotive was equipped with a tan-shaped snowplow. An abundant white steam followed, curling from the huge smokestack. The Nord Express, russified at the Verschobolovo, retained the brown facings of its cars and now became more sedate, wide-flanked, thoroughly heated, and instead of gathering full speed right away, took a long time to gain momentum after a stop. It was pleasant to perch on one of the flap sheets of the blue-carpeted corridor, and the lantern-jawed attendant in his chocolate-colored uniform stroked Martin in the head in passing. White fields stretched outside here and there, leafless sallows stuck out of the wind snow. By a crossing gate stood a woman in felt boots, holding a green flag, a peasant who had jumped down from his sledge, shielded with mittens the eyes of his blacking nag, and this night he saw something wonderful. Past the back mirrory window flew thousands of sparks, arrow-like flourishes of fire-tipped pen. 7. From that year on, Martin developed a passion for trains, travels, distant lights, the heart-rending wails of locomotives in the dark of night, the waxworks, vividness of local stations flashing by with people never to be seen again, the slope heaving off, the grating of the rudder chain, the internal tremor of the Canadian freighter on which he and his mother left Crimea in April 1919. The stormy sea and the driving rain were not as conducive to viatic excitement as an express train, and only very gradually did Martin get penetrated with its new enchantment. A disheveled, rain-coated young woman with a black and white scarf around her neck strolled about the deck, blowing the hair around her tickled face, accompanied by her pale husband until the sea got better of them, and in her figure in a flying scarf, Martin fully recognized the travel thrill that captivated him, the sight of the chicken cap, suede gloves their father would put on the railroad compartment, the crocodile satchel worn as a strap over the shoulder of that French girl, with whom it was such fun to roam along a fast train's long corridor, and surged into the fleeing landscape. This young woman was the only one that looked an exemplary sailor, very much unlike the rest of the passengers, whom the captain of this rashly chartered vessel, finding no cargo in crazed Crimea, had agreed to take on board so as not to make the return journey empty, despite the abundant luggage, lumpy, hastily gathered, fastened with a rope instead of straps. All these people somehow gave the impression of traveling light, of sailing as if by chance. The formula of distant journeys could not accommodate their bewilderment and melancholy. They were fleeing before the mortal danger, but for some reason Martin was little disturbed by the fact that this was so. That the ashen-faced profiteer over there, a load of precious stones and a belt next to his skin, had he stayed ashore, would have been killed on the spot. The first Red Army fellow to be tempted by his diamond innards, and Martin followed the Russian shore with an almost indifferent gaze as it receded in the rainy mist, so restrainedly, so simply, without a single sign that might have hinted at the supernatural length of separation. Only when everything had vanished in the fog did he avidly recall in a flash Adrates, the cypresses, the cheerful house whose denizens would reply to the astonished questions of her listless neighbors. Flee? But where would we live if not in the Crimea? And his recollection of Lida was colored differently than their former actual relationship. He remembered how once, when she was complaining about a mosquito bite and scratching the place grown red with a tan on her calf, he wanted to show her how you were supposed to cut across on the swelling with your fingernail, and she had slapped him hard on the hand for no reason at all. He also remembered the farewell visit, when either of them knew what to talk about and kept mentioning Kolya, who had gone shopping in Yalta, and what a relief it was when he finally arrived. Lida's elongated, delicate face, about which there was something doe-like, now haunted Martin quite obsessively, as he lay on a couch beneath a ticking clock in the cabin of the captain, with whom he had become great friends, or shared in reverent silence. The watch of the first mate, a pockmarked Canadian, spoke rarely, but when he did, pronounced the English as if masticating it, but who had set a mysterious chill through Martin's heart at once when he informed him that old salts never sit down even when they go into retirement. The grandchildren sit where their grandfathers walk. The sea remains in one legs. As he grew accustomed to all this nautical novelty, to the tangle of oil and the ships rolling, to the diverse and strange varieties of bread, one of which tasted like Russian uncharacteristic prosphara. Martin kept trying to convince himself that he had gone voyaging out of grief, that he was mourning an ill-starred love, but that no one, seeing his tranquil already with wind-burned face, could have suspected his anguish. Mysterious, wonderful people cropped up. There was the person who had chartered the ship, a sullen Puritan from Nova Scotia, whose raincoat hung in the captain's toilet, which was in a state of hopeless disrepair, pendulating right over the seat. There was a second mate, who, by the name of Patkin, a Jew originally from Odessa, who, despite his American speech, could still perceive the blurry outlines of Russian words. And among the seamen there was a certain Silvio, a Spanish-American, who always walked barefoot and carried a dagger. One day the captain appeared with an injured hand, saying at first that the cat had scratched him, but later, out of friendship, confiding to Martin that he had gashed it on Silvio's tooth when he had hit him for drunkenness on board. Thus, when Martin initiated into seaman's life, the complex architectural structure of the ship, all those steps, mazy passages, swinging doors, soon yielded their secrets to him, and it became difficult to find a still unfamiliar corner. Meanwhile, the lady with the striped scarf seemed to share Martin's curiosity, flitting past the most unexpected places, always with wind-blown hair, always glazing into the distance. Already the second day, her husband was laid out moping, collarless, on the oilcloth bench in the saloon, while the another bench lay Sophia, with a slice of lemon between her lips. Now and then, Martin, too, felt a sucking void in the pit of his stomach, and a kind of general unsteadiness, while the lady was indefatigable, and Martin had already picked her as one of the ones to save in case of disaster. But in spite of the turbulent sea, the ship safely reached the harbor of Constantinople one cold, milkily, gloomy dawn, and suddenly a wet Turk appeared on the deck, and Patkin, who felt the quarantine should be reciprocal, yelled "I'll sunk you" at him, "Ya tabla untuno," and even threatened him with a pistol. Next day they moved on to the Sea of Marmara, and the Bosporus left no impression at all in Martin's memory except for the 3 or 4 minarets that looked like factory chimneys in the mist, and the voice of the lady in the raincoat, who talked to herself out loud as she gazed at the gloomy coast. Martin, staring at her over here, seemed to distinguish the adjective amethyst, amethystfully, but decided he was mistaken. 8. After Constantinople, the sky cleared, though the sea remained oaken, very choppy, as Patkin expressed it. Sophia ventured on deck, but promptly returned to the saloon, saying that there was nothing more hateful in the world than the servile sinking and rising of all one's insides in rhythm with the rising and sinking of the ship's prow. The lady's husband moaned, inquired of God when this would end, and hurriedly, with trembling hands, grabbed for the basin. Martin, who was reclining, a mother holding by the hand, felt that it was useless. He felt at once he would throw up too. At that moment the lady came in with a flick of her scarf and addressed a compassionate question to her husband. Her husband, without speaking or opening his eyes, made a Russian slicing gesture with his hand across his Adam's apple, meaning "I'm being slaughtered," whereupon she asked the same question of Sophia, who responded with a martyred smile. "You don't look too happy either," said the lady, with a severe glance at Martin, and she staggered, tossed the end of her scarf over her shoulder, and then went out. Martin followed her, and the fresh wind in his face and the sight of the bright blue, white-capped sea made him feel better. She was sitting on the same coiled ropes, writing in a small morocco notebook. The young day of the passengers had said about her, "Not bad, that broad," and Martin turned angrily but could not identify the rascal among several despondent middle-aged men with joined-up collars. Now, as he looked up at the red lips, which she kept licking as her pencil whipped across the page, he was embarrassed and did not know what to talk about, and felt a salty taste on his lips. She read on and seemed not to notice him, yet Martin's nice round face is 17 years, a certain trim solidity of build and movement, often present in Russians, but for some reason classified as something British. The whole appearance of Martin in his belted blue overcoat made a certain impression on the lady. She was 25. Her name was Allah. She wrote poetry, 3 things, one would think, that were bound to make a woman fascinating. Her favorite poets were 2 fashionable mediocrities, Paul Giraldi and Victor Goffman, and her own poems, so sonorous, so spicy, always addressed the man in the polite form, "you, not thou," and were sparkled with rubies as red as blood. One of them had recently enjoyed great success in St. Petersburg society. It began thus: "On purple silks, beneath an empire pall, you vampirized me, and caressed me all, and tomorrow die, burned to the end. Our lovely bodies with the sand will blend." The ladies occupied from each other, would copy it from each other, learn it by heart, and recite it, and one naval cadet even set it to music. Married at 18, she remained faithful to her husband for more than 2 years, but the world all around was saturated with ruminous fumes of sin. Clean-shaven, persistent males would schedule their own suicides at 7 Thursday evening, midnight, Christmas Eve, or 3 in the morning under her windows. The dates got jumbled. It was hard to keep up all of those assignations. A Grand Duke languished because of her. Rasputin pestered her for a month with telephone calls, and sometimes she said that her life was but the light smoke of an amber-perfumed Regier cigarette. Martin did not understand any of this at all. Her poetry left him somewhat perplexed. When he said that Constantinople was annoying but amethyst-colored, Allah objected that he was devoid of poetic imagination. On their arrival in Athens gave him Pierre-Louis Chansons de Villages, in a cheap edition illustrated with the naked forms of adolescence, from which she would read to him meaningfully, pronouncing the French in the early evening of the Acropolis. The most appropriate place, one might say, when he found particularly appealing about her speech was the rapidly way she pronounced the letter R, as if there were not just one letter, but a whole gallery, accompanied as if that were not enough by the reflection in water, but instead of those French corbillontics, guitar-filled Petersburgian white knights or libertines, sonants of 5 ditalic stanzas, he managed to find in this girl with a hard-to-assimilate name something quite different. The acquaintance that is imperceptibly begun on the shipboard continued in Greece at the seaside in one of the white hotels of Vladimir. Sophie and our son ended up in a nasty tiny room. Its only window gave on a dusty courtyard, where at dawn, with various agonizing preparatives, a preliminary flapping of the wings and other sounds, a young cock commenced its series of hoarse, cheerful cries. Martin slept on a hard blue couch. Sophia's bed was narrow and unsteady with lumpy mattress. The only representative of the insect kingdom in the room was a solitary flea, which in recompense was very crafty, voracious, and absolutely uncatchable. Allah, who had had a good fortune to get excellent room with twin beds, offered to have Sophia sleep with her, sending her husband over to Martin in exchange. After saying several times in a row, "I wouldn't think of it," Sophia willingly accepted, and the transfer took place that very same day. Chernislavov was big, lanky, sullen, and filled the little room with his presence. Apparently his blood immediately poisoned the flea, as it did not reappear. His toilet implements, a small mirror bisected by a cracked eau de cologne, a shaving brush that he always forgot to rinse, and they would stand the whole day, all stuck together by gelid lather, on window ledge, table, or chair, depressed Martin, and the encroachment was especially hard to bear at bedtime, when he was obliged to clear his couch of the man's various neckties and mesh undershirts. While undressing, Chernislavov would scratch himself listlessly between gaping yawns, and would place an enormous naked foot on the edge of the chair, and thrusting his hand into his hair, freeze this uncomfortable attitude until he slowly came once more into motion, and wound his watch, got into bed, and then for a long time, with as many grunts and groans, kneaded the mattress with his body. Some time later, in the dark, his voice would always pronounce the same sentence: "One special request, my boy, don't foul the air." While shaving in the morning, he would invariably say, "Pimple kill face cream, indispensable at your age." As he dressed, choosing, whenever possible, socks that guaranteed decorum by having holes in the big toe rather than above the heel, he would exclaim, quoting a popular bard, "Ah, yes, in our day we were young coursers, too," and whistle softly through his teeth. This was all very monotonous and unfunny. Martin would smile politely. Yet his awareness of a certain risk afforded some consolation. At any night, in a treacherous dream, he might distinctly pronounce a full-voweled name, and at any night an exasperated husband might steal up with sharpened razor. Chernislavov, of course, used only a safety razor. He treated this little instrument just as sloppily as his brush and the ashtrays, where always contained a rusty blade with a petrified foam dotted with black hairs. His sullenness with insipid sayings seemed to Martin proof of a deep-seated but restrained jealousy. Going as he did to Athens on business for the whole day, he could not help suspecting that his wife was passing the time alone with the good-humored, calm yet worldly wise young fellow that Martin fancied himself. 9. It was very hot and very dusty. The cafe served one a tiny cup of sweet black goo to accompany a huge glass of ice-cold water. On the beach benches, posters with the name of a Russian soprano were growing tattered. The electric train that ran to Athens filled idle blue day with soft pool, whereupon everything grew quiet again. The sleepy little houses of Athens reminded one of the Bavarian townlet. The tawny mountains in the distance were wonderful. Pale poppies quivered in the wind among the bits of broken marble on the Acropolis. Right in the middle of the street, haphazardly, began the tracks on which stood the cars of resort-famed trains. Oranges were ripening in the gardens. There might be a vacant lot with a superb growth of columns, one of them fallen and fractured in 3 places. All of this crumbling yellow marble was gradually being turned over to nature's curatorship. Martin's hotel, destined to remain new for its allotted span, would share the same fate. As he stood on the seashore with Allah, he told himself with an ecstatic chill that he was lovely in a remote land. And what a condiment that was to being in love! What bliss to stand in the wind next to a laughing woman with wind-blown hair, whose bright skirt would now be worried, now pressed against her knees by the same breeze that had once filled Ulysses' sails. One day, while they strolled across an uneven sand that stumbled Martin caught her, and she glanced over her shoulder at the sole of her shoe, raised her high heel upward, then stumbled again. That settled it, and he pressed his mouth against her half-opened lips. During this lengthy, rather clumsy embrace they both nearly lost their balance. She freed herself and, laughing, declared he had kissed too wetly and ought to take some lessons. Martin was aware of the humiliating trembling in his legs and of the pounding of his heart. He was furious with himself for this agitation, which reminded him of the moment after a fight at school when his classmates exclaimed, "Look how pale he is! However, his first kiss of his life, shut-eyed and deep, with a kind of quivering point inside whose exact origin he did not immediately understand, was so wonderful, so generously fulfilled his poor feeling, that his dissatisfaction with himself was soon dispelled. The windy, wild day passed in passionate repetitions and improvements, and that evening Martin felt as if he had been toting logs, and when Alla, accompanied by her husband, entered the dining-room, where he and his mother were already peeling their oranges, and sat down at the next table, nimbly undoing the mitre of her napkin, dropping it in her lap with a slight upward flight of her hands, then moving closer to the table together with a chair, a slow flush invaded Martin's face, and for a long time he lacked the courage to meet her gaze, but when at last he did, he failed to find an answering embarrassment in her look. Martin's avid, unbridled imagination would have been incompatible with chastity. Fantasies known as impure had plagued him for the last 2 or 3 years, and he made no particular effort to resist them. At first they existed separately from the actual infatuations of his early boyhood. One memorable winter night in St. Petersburg, after he had taken part in some home theatricals and was still made up, charcoaled eyebrows, dressed in a white Russian blouse, he shut himself in a closet with a coeval girl cousin, who made up with a kerchief and eyebrow level. As he squeezed her moist little hands, Martin had keenly sensed the romantic nature of this behavior, but had not been excited by it. Main Ride's hero, Maurice Gerald, having stopped his steed side by side with that of Louise Poindexter, put his arm around the blonde Creole's limber waist, and there the author exclaimed with a personal aside, "What can compare with such a kiss?" Things like that provided a far greater erotic thrill. What fired him as a rule was the remote, the forbidden, the vague, anything sufficiently indistinct to make his fantasy work in establishing details, whether a portrait of a Lady Hamilton or a pop-eyed schoolmate's whisperings about houses of youthful repute. Now the mist was thinned. Visibly had improved. He was too engrossed in those sensations to give due attention to Allah's actual pronouncements. "I shall remain for you a glamorous dream. I am insanely voluptuous. You will never forget me as one forgets an old novel read long ago. Know that song? And you must never, never talk about me to your future mistresses." As for Sophia, she was pleased and displeased at the same time. With some acquaintance would coyly report, "We were out strolling yesterday, and we saw him, yes we did, with a poetess on his arm. Lost his head completely." "That boy of yours." Sophia replied that this was all quite natural at his age. Martin's early revelation of manly passions made her proud, yet she could not ignore the fact that even though Alla was a sweet, affable young lady, she was perhaps a little too fast, as the English say, and while excusing her son's folly, Sophia did not excuse Alla's extractive vulgarity. Fortunately, their stay in Greece was coming to an end. Within a few days, Sophia expected from Henry Edelweiss, her husband's cousin in Switzerland, a reply to a very frank letter, written with great difficulty about her husband's death and the exhaustion of their good means. Henry used to visit them in Russia, was good friends with her and her husband, was fond of his nephew, and always enjoyed the reputation of an honest and generous man. "Do you remember, Martin, when he was the last time that Uncle Henry came to see us? In any case, it was before, wasn't it? That before, always lacking an object, meant before the quarrel, before the separation from her husband, and Martin would also say before or after, without further qualification. "I think it was after," he answered, recalling how Uncle Henry had arrived at their dacha, and had a long private interview with his mother, and emerged red-eyed, as he particularly lachrymose, and even cried at the movies. "Yes, of course, how stupid of me," Sophia sighed quickly, suddenly reconstructing his visit, the discussion they had made about her husband, Henry's exhortations they make up. "And you remember him well, don't you? Every time he came he brought you something. The last time it was a room-to-room telephone," said Martin, making a face. "Installing the telephone was boring, and when somebody finally did install it, running it from the nursery to his mother's room, it never worked well, and then broke down altogether and was abandoned along with the previous gifts of Uncle, such as the Swiss Family Robinson, for instance, which was extremely dull after the real Robinson Crusoe, or the tin freight cars, which had proved secret tears of disappointment, for Martin liked only passenger trains." "Why are you grimacing?" asked Sophia. He explained, and she said with a laugh, that's true, and stopped to think for a moment about Martin's childhood, about irretrievable, ineffable things, and there was a heart-rending charm about this reverie. How quickly everything had passed. Just think, he has begun to shave, to clean nails. That smart lilac necktie That woman is very sweet, of course," said Sophia, "but don't think she's just a little too lively. You shouldn't get carried away like this. Tell me, no, I prefer not to ask you anything. Only they say she has a terrible flirt in St. Petersburg. And don't tell me you really like her poetry, that female demonism. She has such an affected way of reciting verse. Is it true you've reached the point of, I don't know, holding hands or something like that?" Martin smiled enigmatically. "I'm sure there's nothing between you," said Sophia, slyly, considering with love the twinkling, equally sly eyes of her son. "I'm certain there is nothing. You aren't old enough yet." Martin laughed. She pulled him close and planted a juicy, greedy kiss on his cheek. All this was taking place at the garden table on the terrace before the hotel. Early in the morning, the day promised to be lovely. The cloudless sky still had a hazy cast, as a sheet of gauze paper sometimes covers an exceptionally vivid frontispiece in an expensive edition of fairy tales. Martin carefully removed this translucent sheet, and there, down the white steps, swinging her low hips ever so slightly, wearing a bright blue skirt, across which an orderly ripple ran back and forth, as stepping down with calculated unhurriedness, first one foot and then the other extended the tip of his polished shoe, rhythmically balancing her brocaded handbag. Already smiling, her hair parted on one side, came a limpid-eyed, slender-necked woman with the large black earrings that also swung in rhythm with her descent. Martin went to meet her, kissed her hand, stepped back, and she, laughing and rolling her R's, greeted Sophia, who sat in a wicker armchair, smoking a thick English cigarette, her first after her morning coffee. "You were sleeping so prettily, Alla, that I didn't want to wake you," said Sophia, her long enameled cigarette holder held at a distance, and glancing out of a corner of her eye at Martin, who now sat on the balustrade swinging his legs. Bubbling over with excitement, Alla began recounting the dreams she had seen last night, marvelous marvel dreams, with priests of ancient Greece whose capacity to appear in dreams Sophia strongly doubted, and the freshly watered gavel glistened moistly. Martin's curiosity grew. The rambles on the beach and the kisses that anyone could spy on began to seem too lengthy and forward. At the same time, his desire for the main text was mixed with anxiety. Martin failed to imagine certain details, and his inexperience alarmed him. The unforgettable day on which Allah said that she was not made of wood, that he must not caress her like that, and that after lunch, when her husband was safely away in the city and Sophia was enjoying her siesta, she would slip into Martin's room and show him somebody's poems. That day was the very same one that opened with a conversation about Uncle Henry and the room-to-room telephone. When later in Switzerland, Uncle Henry gave Martin a black statuette, a soccer player dribbling in the ball, for his birthday, Martin could not understand why. The very instant his uncle placed that useless object on the table, he pictured with astounding clarity a distant tender morning in Greece with Allah, descending the white stairs. Right after dinner he had gone to his room and begun to wait. Chernisov's shaving brush he hid behind the mirror. Somehow its presence encumbered him. From the courtyard came a clang of water pails, the plashing of water, and the sound of guttural speech. The yellow window curtain swelled mellowly, and a spot of sunlight changed its shape on the floor. Instead of circles, the flies described parallelograms, trapezoids, around the shaft of the ceiling lamp, settling every now and then on the brass. He took off his jacket and collar and lay down supine on the couch, computed with the thump of his heart. When he heard the light footfalls and the knock on his door, something seemed to snap at the pit of his stomach. "Look, I brought the whole batch," said Allah in a conniving whisper, but at the moment Martin could not care less about the verse. "What a wild boy, goodness, what a wild boy," she kept whispering as she helped him discreetly. Martin hurried, pursued rapture, overtook it, and she covered his mouth with her hand, saying under her breath, "Shh, the people next door. This at least, a little object that will stay with you always," said Uncle Henry in a clear voice, and leaned back, openly admiring the statuette. At 18, a person must already think about decorating his future study, and since you're not fond of English games, "It's beautiful," said Martin, not wishing to hurt his uncle, and ran his fingers over the motionless ball at the tip of the player's boot. Around the wooden chalet grew dense firs, fog behind the mountains. Hot, tawny Greece was indeed left far behind, but how vibrant the emotion of that proud festive day! "I have a mistress!" What a conspiratorial air of the blue coach had later that evening. At that time Chernisov, as usual, scratched over the shoulder blades, assumed weary attitudes, then creaked in the dark, requested the wind should not get free, at last snored, whistling through his nose, and Martin thought, oh, if only he knew. And then one day, when all the rights her husband ought to have been in the city and his and Martin's room, Allah was rearranging her dress, having already taken a peek into the paradise, as she put it, while Martin, sweaty and disheveled, was searching for a cufflink, dropped in that same paradise. Suddenly, with a powerful nudge at the door, Chernisov came in and said, "So that's where you are, dear. I forgot, of course, to take Spiridonov's letter with me. Fine muddle that would have been." Allah ran her hand over her wrinkled skirt, and asked with a frown, "Has he signed yet? That old bastard Bernstein kept stalling," said Chernisov, digging in his suitcase. "If they want to delay payment, they can darn well get out of the mess themselves, the swine. Don't forget the postponement, that's the main thing," said Allah. "Well, if you found it, darn this mother to mucking hell," muttered Chernisov, rummaging through the stone envelopes. It's got to be here. It can't have got lost after all. If it is lost, then the whole thing has fallen through, she said with displeasure. Dawdling, muttered Chernisov. It's no way to do business. It's enough to drive you nuts. I'll be very glad if Spiridonov refuses. Now don't you get upset like that. It'll turn up, said Alla, but she too was visibly disturbed. Here it is, thank heaven, said Chernisov, and scanned the paper he had found while his jaw hung loose with concentration. Don't forget to mention the postponement, Alla reminded him. Right-o, said Chernisov, and hurried out of the room. This business conversation left Martin somewhat perplexed. Neither husband nor wife had pretended. They had really quite forgotten that he was present, absorbed as they were by their problems. Alla, however, immediately resumed her previous mood, joked about the inefficiency of Greek door locks that opened all by themselves, and shrugged off Martin's alarmed question. Oh, don't worry, he didn't notice anything. That night Martin could not get to sleep for a long time, and with the same perplexity kept listening to the complacent snoring. When 3 days later he sailed with his mother for Marseille, the Chernisovs came to see them off at Paris. They stood on the pier, arm in arm, and Alla was smiling and waving a mimosa branch. The day before, though, she had shed a tear or two.